Okay, guys, so this is the last podcast for this week. Thank goodness, right? This is on the sense organs. Um, we have millions and millions of sensory receptors throughout our body. Some of them combine with muscle and tissue to form some sense organs. Most of them though, are specialized nerve cells or nerve endings. They allow us to know what is happening in our environment, our eyes, ears, nose, and then the sense of touch and taste. The brain filters out most of the stimuli detected by the receptors so that they stay below our level of awareness, but some of them do have to get through. Sensory receptors transmit information about the type of stimulus it's sensing, the location, and the intensity. Each sensory receptor responds to a different stimulus. Cold receptors only respond to cold. Light receptors only respond to light. Each sensory neuron responds to stimuli in a certain area called a receptive field. These areas, like the tips of your fingers, contain many receptors. Because each neuron covers a tiny territory, the brain can then pinpoint the location of the stimulus. Less sensitive areas like the back have fewer receptors. Consequently, the brain can't always pinpoint the exact location where that stimulus is. The stronger a stimulus makes sense, the more nerve fibers fire. This allows the brain to interpret the intensity of the sensation. And when the stimulus is continuous, the firing frequency will slow down, which causes the sensation to diminish. This is what's known as adaptation. There are classification of receptors. Chemoreceptors react to chemicals, including odors, taste, and the concentration of such chemicals like glucose or carbon dioxide. Mechanoreceptors respond to factors such as pressure, stretch, and vibration, the vibration that may change the position of the receptor. Thermoreceptors, that name's pretty self-explanatory. These respond to changes in temperature. Nociceptors are pain receptors. They respond to tissue damage from trauma, as well as from heat, chemicals, pressure, or a lack of oxygen. Photoreceptors respond to light. These receptors are only found in your eyes. And then proprioceptors, these are found in the skeletal muscles, joints, and tendons. These give information about body movement, muscle stretch, and the general orientation of the body. You are going to need to know these and the difference between these. General senses include pain, pressure, touch, stretch, and temperature. And these involve receptors that are widely distributed in the skin, the muscles, the tendons, the joints, and the viscera. Remember, viscera is the lining inside your body cavities. Okay, so we're going to talk about pain a little bit. Pain is sensed by nociceptors. Remember, we just talked about that. These are free nerve endings that carry impulses to the brain. They're really abundant in the skin and the mucous membranes, but they're found pretty much everywhere in every organ. They use fast and slow pain fibers. The fast pain fibers are abundant in the skin and the mucous membranes. They produce a sharp, localized, stabbing type pain at the time of injury. Slow pain fibers are congregated on deep body organs and structures, and they produce kind of like a dull, aching pain. So the body organs, so like stomach pain, that's why usually stomach pain is kind of dull and achy. Whereas if you poke yourself on your finger, that's a sharp stabbing kind of pain. The brain does not have any nociceptors at all. The pain pathway, it can be a little complicated. What I basically want you to know about the pain pathway is that when something happens that causes pain, injured tissues release chemicals. These chemicals are what stimulate the nociceptors and trigger the pain. The pain signal then goes from the neuron to the dorsal horn. Remember, that's in the back of the spinal column, spinal cord, and then up the spinal thalamic tract to the thalamus. From the thalamus, it goes to the reticular formation of the brainstem. The thalamus relays the signal from the tract to the postcentral gyrus of the cerebrum. Let me start that again. A neuron conducts the pain signal to the dorsal horn that's in the back of the spinal cord and up the spinal thalamic tract to the thalamus. The thalamus relays the signal from the spinal thalamic tract to the postcentral gyrus of the cerebrum, and it's at that point that you become aware of the pain. The impulse from the spinal reticular tract bypasses the thalamus and travels to the hypothalamus and the limbic system. These areas trigger emotional and behavioral responses to pain, such as fear and nausea. There's such a thing called referred pain. This is pain where it actually originates in a deep organ, but it might be sensed as if it's coming from another part of the body or another area on the body surface. This happens like problems with the liver and the gallbladder. Sometimes will cause referred pain to the shoulder or the neck. Heart pain can cause pain to the middle of the back or radiating down your arm. The same thing. This happens because the sensory fibers from an organ and those from an area of skin converge into one pathway. So then the pain coming in that pathway to the brain can't differentiate where it first started from. So then you feel that's where we get the referred pain. And as a result, the brain may misidentify pain from one area, like the heart, as coming from another area, like the chest or the arm. So the special senses, they include taste, smell, hearing, equilibrium, and vision. They involve receptors that are grouped together or clustered in specialized organs. Organs like taste, they're clustered in the tongue. Another name for taste is gustation. This results when chemicals come in contact with the taste buds. Most of these taste buds are located around protrusions on your tongue called papilla. There's 4 types of them. I'm not going to expect you to know the 4 types, but just know that papilla are on protrusions on your tongue. Taste buds look a lot like an orange. You can see in this picture. And each segment contains 25 to 50 chemoreceptors called gustatory cells or taste cells. There's a hair-like tip that projects into an opening called the taste pore that's bathed in saliva. Chemicals dissolved in the saliva stimulate the gustatory cells, which then stimulate certain cranial nerves. The taste buds send the impulses to the brain, and the brain interprets what it is that you're tasting. You don't need to know the names of the cranial nerves that are involved. Just know that the cranial nerves do help to transmit that impulse. Smell, we know, is in our nose. An incoming odor will bind to cilia that are projecting from the ends of olfactory receptor cells. This stimulates an impulse along nerve fibers that leaves the nasal cavity through pores in the ethmoid bone. These fibers synapse with other neurons and olfactory bulbs. These olfactory bulbs are like a pair of structures residing just inside the brain's frontal lobe. Intermediate neurons called glomeruli partially process the impulses. These signals continue on to the primary olfactory cortex in the brain. The ears, this one's a little more involved. Let's talk about the parts of the ear. First of all, the ears provide the sense of hearing. They're also essential for balance. And there's 3 sections to the ear. There's the outer ear, you can see right here. That ear has, the outer ear consists of the auricle or the pinna, which is really like your ear lobe and, the outer part of your ear. And the auditory canal, which is the ear canal. The auricle is cartilage, and it really funnels the sound into the auditory canal. The canal leads through the temporal bone to the eardrum. Glands lining the auditory canal produce secretions that mix with dead skin cells to form cerumen or earwax. This earwax waterproofs the canal. It also acts to trap dirt and bacteria. The middle ear, and you can see it here, we're going to have a better picture. The middle ear contains the auditory ossicles, the 3 bones of the ear, the tiniest, smallest bones in the body. And they're named for their shape, really, the malleus, or the hammer, because it kind of looks like a hammer, sort of. The incus, or the anvil, because it's kind of sort of looks like an anvil. And then the stapes, or the stirrup, which is right here. That to me, I can really see the stirrup in that one. But the other 2, it's a little hard in this particular picture. The stapes fits within the oval window, which is the beginning of the inner ear. The tympanic membrane, or the eardrum, right here, separates the outer ear from the middle ear, and it vibrates freely in response to sound waves. The auditory, or the eustachian tube, is a passageway, this right here. is a passageway from the middle ear to the nasopharynx. It equalizes pressure on both sides of the tympanic membrane. It also can allow infection to spread from the throat up to the middle ear. And then the inner ear, this is a complicated system of passageways that it's contained inside the temporal bone. The membranous labyrinth lines the bony labyrinth, and fluid called perilymph cushions the space between the two of them. Endolymph occupies the inside of the membranous labyrinth. The bony labyrinth consists of semicircular canals, that's these right here. The vestibule, which is right here, looks like kind of an opening, and the cochlea, which is this thing that looks, I remember always learning this looked like the shell of a snail. Semicircular canals are crucial for the maintenance of equilibrium and balance. The vestibule marks the entrance to the labyrinth and contains organs necessary for the sense of balance. So this oval window, if you remember, the oval window is where the stapes or the stirrup of the three bones in the ear rests in, and that really opens up. So that's what this vestibule is, really the opening or the vestibule of the inner ear. The cochlea contains the structures for hearing, and the spirals of the cochlea are divided into three compartments. I'm not going to expect you to know about those three compartments. Taking an even closer look at the inner ear, resting on the floor of the triangular duct inside the cochlea is the organ of Corti, which is the hearing sense organ. The organ of Corti, as some guy named Corti probably found it, consists of a layer of epithelium composed of sensory and supporting cells. There are thousands of hair cells project from this epithelial layer and are topped with a gelatin-like membrane called tectorial membrane. Nerve fibers extending from the base of these hairs eventually form the cochlear nerve, which is one of the cranial nerves. How does hearing occur? Sound waves travel down the external auditory canal, so right here, all these waves are traveling down here, and they hit the tympanic membrane or the eardrum and start it to vibrate. The vibrate then spreads through the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup, and then the stirrup shakes. The stirrup hits against the oval window, which then shakes the perilymph on both sides of the cochlear duct right here. That those ripples continue through, travel through the roof of the cochlear duct to the organ of Corti. It's got one pictured right here. And then the movement there stimulates the hairs on the organ of Corti to send nerve impulses along the nerve to the auditory cortex in the brain's temporal lobe, where the brain then interprets those waves as sound. Ripples continue through all this perilymph until they dissipate against the round window here at the end of the organ of Corti. And then again, you know, your eustachian tube that helps to equalize pressure. Your ears are important for balance. The vestibule and the semicircular canals play a key role in the process of balance. There are three fluid-filled semicircular canals that lie at right angles to one another. That's these all right here. Okay, at the end of each canal is a bulb-like area called an ampulla. So here and here and here are the ampulla. Within each ampulla is a mound of hair cells topped by a gelatinous cone-shaped cap called the cupula. The lightweight cupula floats in the endolymph that fills the semicircular canals. Inside the vestibule are two sense organs, the utricle and the saccule. These also consist of a patch of hair cells, and the tips of the hair cells are covered again by a gelatin-like material, and embedded throughout the gelatin material are heavy mineral crystals called otoliths. The semicircular canals and the vestibule monitor different aspects of balance. The semicircular canals, remember, those are the ones with the ampullas. They're concerned with the speed and the direction of head movements. When the head rotates or turns, you know, look from side to side, the endolymph inside the ampulla lags behind. When the movement stops, then the endolymph swirls past the cupula, bends it, and pulls on the hair cells. This stimulates the nerve receptors to send a signal to the brain via one of the cranial nerves. The brain then interprets this information and triggers the responses for maintaining balance when the head or body is suddenly moved. The ultracal and saccule, remember those are inside the vestibule, detect the position of the head when the body is stationary, and they sense acceleration when moving in a straight line, like when you're riding in a car. This is what's known as static equilibrium. Inside the vestibule, the otoliths remain level on the hair cells when the head is level and really causes minimal stimulation. When the head tilts or when the entire body moves forward, like when you nod your head or you bend forward at the waist, the membrane and the otoliths shift and stimulate the hair cells. This then stimulates nearby receptors of the vestibular nerve, one of the cranial nerves, to conduct impulses to the brain, which produces a sense of the head's position. So your ears are quite involved in your sense of balance. Your eyes are as well, to a much lesser extent, but it's really your ears. And it's important to know what type of balance is in which part of the ear. So now we're going to move on to the eyes, and the eyes I think are the last of what we're going to talk about. There's a couple different things to talk about with the eyes. In your eye's work, vision depends on your eye using light to convert stored energy into nervous impulses. And then these nervous impulses travel to the brain where they're interpreted. There's some accessory structures to the eyes. There's the eyebrow. We all know them. The eyebrow enhances facial expressions, aids in nonverbal communication. It helps keep perspiration out of your eyes, and it helps to shield your eyes from glare. The eyelids, and you have an upper eyelid and a lower eyelid. These protect the eye from foreign bodies, and they block light when they're closed to allow for sleeping. Periodic blinking also helps moisten the eyes with tears and wash out debris. The palpebral fissure, I always have trouble with that. That's just the opening between the two eyelids. So obviously it's a different measurement here than here, but it's all called the same thing. The tarsal glands, they lie along the tarsal plate, which is really it's the thickened margin of the lower eyelid. These secrete oil to help keep the tears from evaporating too quickly. Eyelashes, obviously we all know eyelashes. These work to help keep debris out of the eyes. And then conjunctiva, this is a transparent mucous membrane that lines the inner surface of the eyelid. It covers the anterior surface of the eyeball, except for the cornea. So it's what we commonly refer to as the whites of the eyes. This secretes a thin mucus film to keep the eyeball moist. The lacrimal apparatus of the eyes really consists of the lacrimal gland and a series of ducts, which are commonly known as tear ducts. The gland secretes the tears that flow onto the surface. Tears clean and moisten the eye's surface. They deliver oxygen and nutrients to the conjunctiva. They also contain a bacterial enzyme, this is important, called lysozyme, that helps prevent infection. The lacrimal punctum is a tiny pore that exists at the end of each lacrimal canal. Tears drain through this into the lacrimal canal and the nasolacrimal duct. The nasolacrimal duct is the passageway that carries tears into the nasal cavity. Extrinsic eye muscles, the main thing I want you to know about this is that there's 6 of them. They attach the outside of the eyeball, and they control the movement of the eyeball. You don't need to know the names of them or what exact movements they do, just that there's 6 of them, and they're on the outside. There are some tissue layers of the eye. There's a fibrous outer layer, that's the sclera and the cornea. The vascular middle layer, which consists of the choroid, ciliary body, and iris, and an inner layer consisting of the retina, optic nerve, and blood vessels. The sclera, right here, it's dense connective tissue. Remember, go back to the second week when we talked about the different types of tissues, and it's the outermost layer. Most of it's white and opaque, so again, that's the white of the eyes. There are blood vessels and nerves that run throughout the sclera. The cornea is a transparent extension of that. It's in the anterior or the front part of the eye. It's right there. It sits over the iris and emits light. There are no blood vessels in the cornea. The iris is the ring of colored muscle that adjusts the diameter of the pupil. So it's pictured right here. It doesn't really show the pupil all that well, but it's what gives your eye color. It adjusts the diameter of the pupil to control how much light goes into the eye. The ciliary body is a thickened extension of the choroid that forms a collar around the lens. So it's this right here, and it forms a collar around the lens there. It secretes a fluid called aqueous humor. The choroid is a highly vascular layer of tissue. It supplies oxygen and nutrients to the retina and the sclera. It's right here. It goes all the way around. The retina is a thin layer of light-sensitive cells. We're going to talk about those in a couple of minutes. And then the optic nerve exits from the posterior or the back portion of the eyeball and transmits signals to the brain. The retina lines the posterior 2/3 of the eye, and inside the retina are the photoreceptors, commonly known as rods and cones, that are stimulated by light rays to produce an electric or a chemical signal. The center of the retina is a patch of cells called the macula lutea. Inside the macula lutea is a depression called the fovea centralis. This is where most of the cones are concentrated, making this area the part that produces the sharpest vision. Rods are clustered along the outside edges of the retina, and there's none of them in the fovea centralis. Medial, which means more towards the center to the macula lutea, is the optic disc, and this is where the nerve fibers leave the retina and converge to become the optic nerve. Blood vessels enter and leave the eye at the optic disc as well. Cones detect color, rods detect black and white. And I remember that because cones and color both start with C. There are some chambers to your eye. The eye it's a fluid-filled sphere, so there's two main cavities to it, the anterior and the posterior. The anterior cavity you see right here is what is between the lens and the cornea. So here's your lens, and here's your cornea. So this whole thing is the anterior chamber. It's divided, anterior cavity. The anterior cavity is further divided into an anterior chamber and a posterior chamber. The anterior cavity is filled with aqueous humor. So the posterior chamber is the part that is behind the iris but before the lens. So it's a little tiny chamber right here, and then the anterior cavity is all this part between the cornea and the iris. The lens is a transparent disc of tissue just behind the pupil, and then the posterior cavity is this part back here. It's the rest of the eye, really. It's filled with vitreous humor. So the anterior cavity is filled with aqueous humor, and I remember that because they both start with A. And then the posterior cavity is filled with vitreous humor. It's a jelly-like substance, keeps the eyeball from collapsing. The ciliary body is what secretes the aqueous humor, and this fluid flows from the posterior chamber of the anterior cavity through the pupil and into the anterior chamber. And then it drains into a blood vessel called the canal of Schlemm. I know that's all a little complicated. I went kind of fast. This should all be on the summary sheet that I'll be posting. So I think flashcards are probably the best way to keep them straight. The process of vision, we kind of try to think that it's really complicated, but it's not. You need all three of these steps need to happen in order for vision to occur. Light focuses on the retina and produces an upside down image. So the light rays need to be bent or refracted, and then rods and cones convert that image into nerve impulses, and those impulses are transmitted to the brain where they're interpreted. If the object being viewed, so for a retinal image to form, light rays must be bent or refracted so they focus on the retina. And then if the object is close, the eyes must converge on the object, and the pupils must contract. That doesn't make sense, so I'm going to keep going. Refraction is the bending of the light rays. That's what happens to light rays as they pass through the eyes. Light rays that strike the center of the cornea pass straight through, whereas light rays that strike off-center, where the cornea is curved, are bent towards the center. The refracting media of the eye includes the cornea, the aqueous humor, the lens, and the vitreous humor. The curved surface of the cornea refracts most of the light that's entering the eye. So basically, sometimes the light needs to be bent in order to be focused on the back of the retina here to produce that little upside down image. Convergence proper vision requires that light rays from an object fall on the same area of each retina. So convergence lines up the visual axis of each eye toward the object so that the light rays fall on the corresponding parts of each retina. So you can see here your eyes kind of move in order to be able to see, and that's something that's happening without you even realizing it. If eyes fail to converge, then the light rays are going to fall on different parts of the retina, each retina of each eye, and you're going to wind up with some double vision. Pupil constriction. To reduce blurriness when focusing on a nearby object, the pupil constricts to screen out peripheral light rays. And this really depends on muscles inside the iris, the intrinsic eye muscles. The pupillary constrictor muscle encircles the pupil, and when stimulated, the muscle contracts, which narrows the pupil and lets less light in. The pupillary dilator looks like the spokes of a wheel, and when stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system, this muscle contracts, pulling the inside edge of the iris outward. This widens the pupil and lets more light in. And accommodation of the lens. The cornea refracts most of the light. Remember, the cornea bends most of the light that comes in, that comes into the eye, but then the lens fine-tunes it for a sharper focus. Curvature of the lens changes to allow the eye to focus on a near object. This is called accommodation. So we talked about the rods and the cones earlier. Those are the photoreceptors on the retina. There's three types, red, green, and blue. Three types of cones, sorry, because the cones are the ones that detect color. So red, green, and blue, and each responds to the wavelength of light from that particular color. They're more active in bright light. They really produce the sharpest vision. Remember, those are the only ones inside the fovea centralis. And again, they're responsible for color. The rods are more on the outer edges of the retina. They're more active in dim light. They're responsible for night vision, and they can't distinguish colors, so they see the black and white and the gray. And the very last thing we're going to talk about is the transmission of impulses. The final step in the visual process involves relaying the nervous impulses to the brain. So the lights come into the eye. It's made that tiny little upside down image on the back of the eye, and the signal has gone through the optic nerve into the brain. Half of the nerve fibers cross to the opposite side of the brain at the optic chiasm. The impulses travel to the primary visual cortex in the occipital lobe for interpretation. Really, I just want you to know that it travels up the optic nerve and it's interpreted in the occipital lobe of the brain. So that is all about the senses, the different types of receptors, the special sense organs, the taste, smell, hearing, vision, and touch. And that touch includes pain, which also includes referred pain. So please don't be afraid to ask questions. And that's it for this one.